Friends, my name is Eamonn, one of the founders of the Adam Smith Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Ayn Rand Lecture, and to ask you to turn your mobile phone to silent. After the lecture, we'll have some time for questions, and then I hope that you'll join us for a closing drink back in the drawing room. I'd like to start by thanking the Prometheus Foundation and its founder, Carl Barney, who has supported this lecture for over a decade. So thank you very much to them. The Prometheus Foundation exists to advance the thinking of the 20th century novelist and philosopher Ayn Rand, who has profoundly shaped political and moral thought through her philosophy of objectivism, emphasizing rationality, self-reliance, and economic freedom. Her novels, The Fountainhead, 1943, and Atlas Shrugged, 1957, illustrate these principles, portraying heroes who defy collectivist thinking to pursue personal excellence and innovation. Lance Forman is someone who epitomizes Ayn Rand's key virtues, such as independence, integrity, productivity, and justice. A former president of the Cambridge Union, government advisor, and member of the European Parliament, Lance is the fourth generation head of H. Forman and Sons, founded by his Russian emigre great-grandfather in 1905. He's diligently preserved what is London's last traditional salmon smokehouse, taking it into online delivery and indeed a riverside restaurant. And he successfully fought the government against compulsory relocation of his business for the 2012 elections, an experience he recounted in his book, Forman's Games. So, to give the 2025 Ayn Rand Lecture, it gives me great pleasure to introduce and please welcome Lance Forman.
Thank you, Eamonn, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am genuinely honoured, truly honoured, to have been invited to deliver this 2025 Ayn Rand Lecture by the Adam Smith Institute. My relationship with the ASI actually dates back quite a few years. When I was at Cambridge University, a group of friends and myself set up an organisation called the Cambridge University Libertarians. And we would often have events and invited both Eamonn and Madsen, I'm not sure where Madsen's sitting, somewhere here, I see him, somewhere there. And they'd be invited to our events, and they would nearly always attend, particularly the social events. They'd always be there. And we've kept in touch since, and indeed, when I met with Madsen, particularly in the company of other people, Madsen has always proudly introduced me as the former president of the Cambridge Union and the person who invited him to deliver his maiden speech at that society. Now, I'm really pleased that I've been able to find and dig out a copy of the order paper from that evening, and it reads as follows here: Cambridge Union Society second debate, Monday the 21st of January 1985. This House believes that government governs best when it governs least. Yeah. Clearly nothing's changed on that front. And so, I have to thank you very much, Madsen, for this reciprocal invitation. It's only taken 40 years, 9 months and 1 day, but who's counting? Now, I was told that the attendees tonight would be a sort of dose of free market libertarians with a dusting of Ayn Rand, and was recommended that my talk might be on the importance of commitment to goals, overriding bureaucrats and naysayers, and being determined to achieve. And that's precisely what I plan to do. But I guess I ought to kick off with just a few obvious connections between myself and Ayn Rand. As Eamonn mentioned, Ayn Rand, born in 1905, was a Russian-Jewish emigre. He moved to the USA. Our own business was started by my great-grandfather 4 generations ago. He was also a Russian-Jewish emigre, and indeed our business was started in the same year of Ayn Rand's birth, 1905. Ayn Rand believed principally that society would benefit if people behaved rationally and were selfish. So we believe that our 120-year-old business has survived because we have behaved rationally and we selfish. Now, it gets better. If you go back about a generation and you ask business people, you know, how's business? A typical response, and it might be slightly tongue-in-cheek, but a typical response would be, you know what, if I didn't have customers and didn't have staff, everything would be absolutely fine and dandy. That's not what business people say today. If you ask business people about how business is going, they will complain about red tape, rules, regulations, bureaucracy, state interference. That is the biggest gripe of business today. And indeed, the number one reason why businesses pack up today, particularly family businesses, isn't because they can't make a profit, isn't because there's no succession in the business. It's because the business owner comes into work one day and he just says, I'm completely fed up. I just don't need any of this hassle anymore. It's just too much grief. I've got enough money in the bank. I'm just going to retire, and that's it. Rand, she despised bureaucracy. I despise bureaucracy. She despised bureaucracy. She said that it would stifle ambition and achievement. And of course, that would cripple economic progress and productivity. It creates crony capitalism. It makes business subject to the whims of unelected bureaucrats. So in this talk, which I've titled Swimming Against the Tide, what I plan to do is give you a few of these mad examples in business that we've had to face on a day-to-day basis. But it's literally every day. You know, every single day brings new challenges as a result of bureaucracy and red tape. But I brought you a few little examples, and then I will finish with the biggest challenge we've had to face as a business from state interference, and that was when we were compulsorily evicted, purchased, whatever you want to call it, by the state for the Olympics. But first, I'd like to preface that by saying a little bit about government and business and the dangers, well, not so much government and business, but the dangers of getting involved in politics if you're a business person. Because it is dangerous. I mean, it's less dangerous for us because politics and oily fish have got a lot in common. But it is dangerous because when you get involved in politics, politics is very divisive. You're going to offend half your customers. It's really, you know, for a lot of business people, they just don't like to get involved. In my particular instance, you know, I first started getting involved in the Brexit debate. This was the biggest issue to face our country, and I thought it was really important that the public heard from business people. You know, if they didn't hear from what the business community thought about this, how could they even begin to understand it? So many business people shied away from it, but I thought it was really important to speak out. And we know we lost business as a result of that. I'm sure we probably gained some that we didn't know about, but I'll give you an example. We had one particular customer. It was a restaurant. They were buying sides of smoked salmon from us every day, and the business was good. And then one day it all just stopped. And I called the chef and I said, is there a problem? Has the quality gone down the drain, or our service isn't as good as it used to be? And he said, no, you need to speak to the owner. And I called this owner, and again I said the same thing, is there a problem with our product? And she said, well, Mr. Forman, the problem is that you're a Brexit supporter, and I can't bring myself to sign a cheque to your company. So I said that you can pay by direct debit. It's really not a problem. But she wouldn't have it. I said, look, when customers come into your restaurant, do you ask them if they're Brexit supporters or Remainers? Because surely if you don't engage with people because of Brexit, she said, well, that's different. I said, well, I don't think it is different. And, this is my personal view. It's not my business view. Half of my staff are probably on the Remain side and half are not. And, I said, do you speak to your other suppliers and ask them what their views are on climate change or, abortion or any other issue? This is absolutely ridiculous. She wouldn't have it. We lost the business. Other issues, I was, and in fact, social media is also very dangerous. My biggest customer a few years ago was a shopping channel, you may have heard of, called QVC. I was selling smoked salmon on QVC. They became my biggest single customer. And literally, that business just stopped overnight because of something I tweeted. And it was ridiculous. Our business was growing with them. I'd been on Twitter for many years, but they called me in and they said they can't trade with me anymore because I don't share their corporate values. Mad. So I left the meeting totally distraught, and I thought, well, let me do a little bit of research. And I researched QVC and found out that they were owned by a business in the States called Liberty Media. And the chairman of Liberty Media was a billionaire American called John Malone. He was the largest single donor to Trump's inauguration, first time round. They clearly didn't even know what their own corporate values were, but there they were, thumbs down. It was mad. We get attacks on social media. People give us negative reviews, not because of our product, but because they might not like my view on climate change or on Brexit or whatever. So I do urge you all, when you leave tonight, go onto Google and just give Forman and Son a fantastic review. You tried the smoked salmon in the reception, but you had the sample, so please do that. But as I said, a few examples of some of the mad stuff that we have to do as a business. We're a food business. We have fridges everywhere. There's fridges everywhere. Fridges nowadays are all electronically monitored. If somebody accidentally leaves the fridge door open for a little bit too long, an alarm will go off. So we have these fridges for temperature control. We have to have audits as a business. Not only audits from our local environmental health people, but clients insist on doing audits, and all sorts of organisations want to audit us. And they're not happy with the electronic monitoring. What they want us to do is they want us to go around the factory 3 times a day with a thermometer, walking into the fridge and checking that the fridge is at the right temperature. Now, it's pointless, but we have to do it because we want to carry on, working with this customer. But that's not good enough. They want to ensure that on a weekly or monthly basis, we check those thermometers to make sure the thermometers are correct. So we have to check them against other thermometers to make sure they're all reading correctly. That's not good enough. Once a year, they insist, and they want to see a certificate that we've sent these thermometers off to an independent lab to have them calibrated. We do all this stuff. It's completely just mad. We do it because we have to. We had an audit recently, and the auditor came along and he looked through all these sheets that had been ticked off, and he said, well, this is not acceptable. We said, why is that? And he said, well, you haven't had a manager sign it off to say he's reviewed them and they're all okay. This is the sort of stuff we have to do with. I reckon that we're paying somewhere between 10 to 20% of our salary costs doing all this nonsensical stuff. It's completely unproductive, a complete waste of time, and we're not the only ones. Every business has to do this stuff. It's really not good for the economy. Another example, we talked about, or Rand talked about, being subject to the whims of bureaucrats. This was a number of years ago, but it's an extraordinary example. We were approached by an Australian company that wanted to sell us Western Australian lobsters. Now, if anyone's familiar with them, these are the Rolls-Royce of the lobster world. And they approached us because their market in Japan had collapsed. There was an economic difficulties in Japan. They were looking for new markets, and they came to us. And I said to this sales person that looks quite interesting, and as it happens, I'm seeing a couple of clients in the next week. One of them was the chef at Wimbledon. Wimbledon was about to happen. We were supplying the smoked salmon. And another one was the chef who worked for Her Majesty the Queen. She was doing some kind of garden party. And I said, look, I'll take these lobsters and see what they think. So I took the lobsters. Both chefs absolutely loved the product. I got back onto these people in Australia. I said, really excited. This is really good news. We need to order a huge quantity, £50,000 worth of these lobsters. Please send them. We must have them next week because this is all. They got really excited too. So they were really happy about it. So they sent over the lobsters. They arrived at Heathrow Airport. I get a phone call from the border officials, and they said, Mr. Forman, we have 2 pallets of Australian lobsters here for you. Great, fantastic. But there's a problem. Oh, what's the problem? They said, well, the documentation says that they have to be frozen at minus 18 degrees, and we just temperature tested them and they're minus 15 degrees, so we can't let them through. Sorry? Are they dripping all over your floor? No, they're solid frozen, but they're the wrong temperature. I said, well, you know, they're solid frozen. We're going to say, we're defrosting them in the next day or two anyway, so it really doesn't matter. They're going to be eaten within a week. They said, well, I'm sorry, but we can't allow these through. It doesn't match the documentation. So I said, well, what are you going to do with them? They said, well, we'll have to burn them. We'll just dispose of them. So £50,000 worth of lobsters. They said, yes, well, we can't do it. So, shock horror. We had to deal with that, but the bigger problem for us was that we promised these chefs that they'd get their lobsters. So I got straight on to the Australians and I said, look, there's really bad news, but these lobsters, I hope you're insured because these lobsters are going to be destroyed. But what's even worse is that you're going to have to send me a replacement shipment, and I need them now. And you're going to have to make sure there's extra sort of temperature protection and so on, so that they arrive safely. So they sent another batch. They did it. They sent another batch. They arrived at Heathrow Airport. Customs officials or the border officials contact me and they phone up. They say, Mr. Forman, 2 pallets of lobsters have arrived from Australia. Great. There's bad news. What's the news? And they said, well, the documentation says they have to be at minus 18 and these are at minus 16. They said, but don't worry, we'll let them through. Why didn't they do that the first time? They could have done that the first time. And the frustrating thing is, as a business, we have to engage with these border officials. We can't start shouting and screaming at them because we need them on our side in case there are issues, further forward. So you're totally at the whim of these officials. It's become a racket too. We have big customers that charge us to do an audit. They don't just come and do an audit. They say, right, if you want to supply us, you've got to pay £1,000 for the audit, and we'll send the auditor around. And of course, we have to oblige. And the auditor comes around, and we say to the auditor, oh, you're doing such a great job. We actually need to audit our suppliers because that's part of the whole process. They want to see that you're checking your suppliers. How much do you charge to do these audits? And they say, oh, we charge £300. So, the larger company is making it's become a profit centre for them. It's a whole industry. This whole regulation thing has become an industry, and we really need to do something to end it. But let me move on to the biggest challenge that we've ever had to face as a business. So there we were, in East London, Hackney Wick, November 2003. And we received I received a letter from an organisation called the London Development Agency. It was part of the GLA. Ken Livingstone was Mayor of London at the time, remember him? Tony Blair was Prime Minister. And this letter basically said, Dear Mr. Forman, I'm afraid you might need to relocate your factory because the site you're on is where we want to build the Olympic Stadium. Now that was really annoying. And it was particularly annoying because we'd only just moved there. And we'd only just moved there with some grant funding from an organisation called the London Development Agency. The same people that helped us move in were telling us within a year we had to move out. And the reason they gave us support, and the reason we built that factory is because our previous factory, where we've been for the last 40 years, had flooded when the local river overflowed because somebody forgot to open the lock gates and the water levels came too high, and our whole factory was completely a metre underwater. And if that wasn't bad enough, that flooded factory had only just been refurbished because 18 months beforehand we had a fire which burnt down 3/4 of it. So literally within the space of 5 years, we had a fire followed by a flood, followed by a compulsory purchase. And I have to say that they were all very challenging, but the compulsory purchase was the hardest of all. You know, if you have a fire or a flood, these are instantaneous events. You just got to do whatever you need to do to work your way through it. But the Olympics was almost like looking into the distance, and there's this giant steamroller sort of heading in your direction, and any which way you move, it keeps sort of turning, and you know this thing's going to crush you. Now, the official narrative of the London Olympic Games was that this is about the regeneration of East London. You remember that? They talked about this is a derelict wasteland that was going to be regenerated by the London Olympic Games. Nothing could be further from the truth. Okay, this area of land, this 500 acres of land where the London Olympics took place, was the greatest concentration of manufacturing land in the whole of London that was essentially going to be wiped out for 17 days of sport. There were 350 businesses there employing 12,500 people, businesses that have been there for decades, 100 years in some cases. And the government had to claim that this was a regeneration project because it didn't have legal powers under compulsory purchase to acquire the land for a sporting event. You know, if they said, we want to host the largest peacetime event the world has ever known, the London Olympics, which indeed it was, they wouldn't have had powers in the courts to acquire the land, so they could only do it on the basis of regeneration. And it was obvious to me that this was not about regeneration. Typically, under compulsory purchase, they expect you to hire lawyers and hire surveyors to fight your corner on the valuation of your land. But I did a lot of research into the law, and I realized that the law itself is unfair. So there was no point in hiring lawyers, and we'd have to find some way of combating this whole thing ourselves and making our own case. You know, is the Olympics really about destroying 100-year-old businesses? Surely not, you know, and I tried to make that case. So the law itself was unfair, and why was the law unfair? The law is unfair, and every country has its own law. You know, if I was fighting this battle at the Beijing Olympic Games, I probably would have been locked up and never seen again. But so I have to thank my lucky stars it was London, but even so, in London it was very challenging. The reason the law is unfair is because under compulsory purchase law in the UK, you're not allowed to benefit from the scheme under which you're being acquired. When they value your land, they value it in what they call the no-scheme world. So in the case of the Olympics, for example, they say, right, let's go back to a time where we hadn't even thought of bidding for the Olympic Games. Let's go back 10, 12 years. We'll see what your land is worth then, and then we'll add on a bit for inflation, and that's what your land is worth today without the benefit of the Olympics. Now, in theory, that sounds fine, but in practice, it doesn't work because land values have shot up as a result of the Olympics, and of course nobody can afford to relocate. And you're also competing with 350 other businesses for a site to move to, so that's putting upward pressure on prices. On top of that, around the time of the Olympics, around the time of that bid, 2003, 4, 5 we're talking about, if you had an acre of land in that area with a factory on it, it was worth about £1 million. If you had permission to build flats on that same piece of land, that same acre of land, it was worth £8 million. There was a massive, massive differential between residential and industrial. So again, it was impossible for people to move, because if you found a site just outside the Olympic Park with some factory that was going bust and you knew they were going to sell their land, you'd say to them, can I buy your land? £1 million an acre, because that's what the government's offering you, and they'd laugh. They'd say, don't be stupid, it's worth 8. Which of course it would have been. So there was a huge gap between what the government were officially offering you and what it was costing to relocate. And the government knew full well that if they can acquire the land at £1 million an acre, post-Olympics, they're getting an 8-fold increase. This was legalised robbery by the state. This is what was happening. Legally, we didn't have a leg to stand on because the law itself is unfair. So what did we do? Well, the first thing we tried to do was speak to, politicians. None of them wanted to assist in any party. None of them wanted to help because we were seen as being anti-Olympics. And at that time, everybody had to back the bid. Everybody, politicians didn't want to be seen to be anti-Olympics, even though we weren't anti the Olympics. We just wanted to be able to afford to relocate. It was as simple as that. We wanted to carry on being productive, as Ayn Rand would say. So it was very, very challenging. Couldn't get political support at all. And indeed, I think Tessa Jowell was interviewed on some radio program, and when she was asked about the businesses, she said, if we want to make omelettes, we've got to crack a few eggs. We didn't want to be the broken eggs. Smoked salmon omelette can be quite nice, but we didn't want to be the broken eggs. So our next port of call, the media. Let's speak to journalists. Let's try and get the story out there. So I'd invite journalists in to explain what was going on, and they'd say, "Oh my goodness, this is terrible, Mr. Forman. This is a terrible injustice. We're going to write about this." And they'd call me a week later, say, "Just want to check a few facts. Buy the story tomorrow. Buy the newspaper tomorrow, and you'll see the story." And I'd buy the newspaper tomorrow, and I'd turn over the page, and turn over the page, and turn over the page. There was no story, because the British Olympic Association had done a deal with all the newspapers that they wouldn't publish anything that was potentially damaging to the London bid. So you couldn't get a story out either. It was very, very difficult. So what did we do? Well, we decided that the best thing to do, and I'm told that I'm quite good at this, is just be really annoying. And just be a complete annoyance to the authorities. Just get in their hair and get under their skin and just cause them so much trouble that they eventually just worn us out of their hair, and that was the strategy we adopted. And it was always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but it was quite challenging. I did have some interesting advice at the time from a media lawyer, and because we kept trying to get the media story out. And one bit of advice which I advise to all of you is that he said, if you ever want to use the media, never threaten the use of the media. If you threaten the use of the media, first of all, you're giving a heads up to the people you're attacking, so that gives them time to prepare a response. Secondly, the media might actually not run with your story. He said, if you're going to use the media, just do it, because then they panic, and then you get the response you want because they're panicking. So that was quite an interesting piece of advice. But we tried everything. We tried to be really difficult. And one day, completely out of the blue, I received a phone call from some chap that I'd never heard of before, and he said, "Mr. Forman, I know all about your issues with the relocation, and I have a solution. Do you want to meet?" And I said, "Yes, of course, I'll meet." We were really desperate at this stage. We thought, our business was really at risk of collapsing. And I say that seriously because 3/4 of those businesses never survived. Okay, 3/4 of those businesses never survived. So I said, "Yes, of course we'll meet. You know where we are. Come and see us." And he said, No. There's a little hotel in the back of Stratford. I'll be there in about 2 weeks' time. I'll give you a call and we can meet there." Fine. It's all a bit strange. So we met. He didn't give me a business card, and it was all a bit shady. And he spent the next 20 to 30 minutes giving me all his political credentials. He seemed to know half the cabinet pretty well. He was good friends with John Reid, actually, the Secretary of State for Defence at the time. He'd just come back. He told me he'd just come back from Bosnia, and all this stuff was all very interesting, but nothing to do with the Olympics. And eventually he got onto the subject. He said, "Look, Mr. Forman, there's a problem." I said, "Yes, I know that." He said, "There's a problem that the government never thought that they were going to win the Olympic bid." And that of course, is the other problem. When London did bid for this thing, they didn't plan to win. When the president of the IOC, this guy called Jacques Rogge, stood up on this podium in Singapore on the 6th of July 2004, this was the day before the 7/7 bombings, and he stood on that podium, he said, "At the 30th Olympiad, I declare the city of," and everyone thought he was going to say Paris, and he said London. And then the cameras went to Trafalgar Square, and there were thousands of young people going, "Yeah, we're hosting the Olympics," and the government officers they were going, "Oh my God, what are we going to do? We never expected to win this thing," and they won it. So he said, "Look, there's a problem. They never expected to win. They don't have a budget to acquire all the land. He said, but we have a solution because I've been working with a consortium of investors over many years, and we have acquired hundreds of acres of land in this area. And we've got a deal with the government where we're going to give them the land for the use of the Olympics in exchange for getting residential permissions afterwards, so our land will be worth 8 times more. And he said, therefore, I can offer you a lot more for your land than the government are officially offering you. So I looked at him and I said, look, I don't know who you are. You're not my uncle or something. I don't know who you are. It's very sweet of you, but actually, I don't really care what I get for my land. What's important to me is to find somewhere to relocate to, and when I know how much that's going to cost, that's how much I need for my land. I just don't want to be out of pocket in this process. And he said, well, Mr. Forman, we've got so much land, we'll probably be able to find another site that you can relocate to. I said, well, great. When you found something, let me know. I left that meeting, I thought, this is very, very strange. What is actually going on here? And it was very clear to me that this was the government's way of doing some kind of under-the-table deal with me to keep me quiet, because if they offered the same sort of deal to everybody else, you know, the Olympics might have cost 15 billion rather than the 2 billion that they'd budgeted. So it was very odd. And my thoughts then sort of went along the following lines. Well, what do you do if the government is offering you a corrupt deal? Do you do it? Do you not do it? Do you report them to the police? But the police are the government, aren't they? You know, where do you go with that? Where do you go with that? It's very difficult to know what to do. So I decided, well, what I really need to do is I need to try and do some research and find out more about this individual. Can he be trusted? Who is he? And so on. Now, we're talking again, 2005, the internet wasn't as developed as it is today. But over the coming weeks, I did a huge amount of research. This became my life. And I found the most extraordinary links to drugs trafficking in Colombia, the sex slave trade in Bosnia, a vigilante police force in Iraq that had just been given $500 million to set up this new security agency without any tender procedures whatsoever. And everything pointed back to this individual. And my life became pretty scary. It was like a cross between Enemy of the State and the Da Vinci Code. It was really scary. And indeed, this was around the time, and I would go to meetings. I would go to meetings where things were discussed, which I had only had private discussions with people about. So it was very clear that either conversations I was having were being listened to, emails were being read. My life genuinely became scary. And it was around the time, you remember the weapons inspector David Kelly, who sort of talked about the 45 minutes, and, you know, we're talking about the first Iraq war, supposedly committed suicide. He just, you know, it was around that time. So I really got very nervous that I might suddenly just disappear one day. Now, whilst all this was going on, I was also fighting the official battle in the courts about the question of regeneration, because I was claiming that this is not about regeneration. In fact, Stratford City, which has been developed on the opposite side of the Olympic Park, had permission to go ahead. The whole Olympic project held that up by 10 years. Instead of being a catalyst for development, it slowed it down because they couldn't get on and build Stratford City until the Olympics was over. So that was my case, and I was making it in the courts, and I received a phone call from the government. They said, Mr. Forman, I was due to appear to cross-examine Sebastian Coe. Remember him? He was chairman of LOCOG, the organising committee of the Olympic Games. And I was due to appear to cross-examine him, and they said, Mr. Forman, if you drop your cross-examination next week, we'll do a deal with you. And I thought, that's rather good. And I penned a little note to Seb Coe, and I put, Dear Seb, you can run, but you can't hide. And that was going to be the title of my book, but I did actually write a book telling the entire story. It's called Forman's Games. And we were very pleased at the top here to get a little endorsement. And it says here, a fascinating insider account, Boris Johnson. So where does he fit into all of this? So, of course, I had become Ken Livingstone's worst nightmare. You know, he thought there were some sleepy businesses, they just go quietly, get paid off, and that would be it. There was this young guy with blonde spiky hair that was thinking about standing to become Mayor of London around the same time. And so we had an enemy in common. It was Boris. And we became quite good friends at that time. And Boris very kindly agreed when we did find the solution to this problem, and we had this grand opening. We invited Boris to be the official guest to do the, pull the curtain and do the honours. And he agreed to do it, and we had a few hundred people along one morning for a champagne and smoked salmon breakfast reception. And Boris arrived with all his PR team and his crew and so on. I put a glass of fizz in his hand. And his press people ran straight over to me and they said, "Mr. Forman, I don't want to cause any embarrassment. I hope it's not a problem. We just don't like Boris being photographed with champagne. Do you mind? We just don't, hope it's not going to be a problem." And we said, no, that's absolutely fine. Can we get him a mug of tea or coffee or something? They said, no, he'll have the champagne, but put it in a mug. Which we... I also remember, so we did have quite a lot of press at that event, and somebody came over to me from I think it was the Evening Standard, and he had a big grin on his face, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Forman, we've just been to the LDA's offices, the London offices, and they think it's very appropriate and actually quite amusing that a business like yours is moving to a part of London called Fish Island," which is absolutely true. And I said, well, actually, it's not nearly as appropriate as the LDA's own recent relocation to the Isle of Dogs. You couldn't make it up. We have had some pretty extraordinary challenges in our time. Ayn Rand believed that the moral purpose of a person's life is to pursue achievement through reason and effort and to be productive. She believed in the power of the individual rather than the collective. Small businesses like Forman's, not grand projects like the Olympic Games. She once described man as a heroic being. Now, I don't claim to be a hero, although I actually was a hero for a day in Paris because I was interviewed by French TV and I announced that I thought that France or Paris should host the 2012 Olympics and not London. But that was short-lived. I do believe that we can't control what happens to us, and we've certainly experienced that, but we certainly can control how we respond, and that's probably a fitting time to end because I might need to control how I respond to you. So thank you.